Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time it is a review of the 1978 immortal classic Halloween, the night he came home. Now, Halloween is a quintessential horror film. It is one of the icons of the genre, and it is without a doubt one of the best films that I can personally think of the genre as well as slasher films, and it's just one of those classics. And what's kind of funny is John Carpenter actually talked. I don't remember if it was John Carpenter, but it was somebody from the crew talked about how they showed this film to an audience at USC at the time of students, and there was one student who uh, decided to speak up about the film and said, "Why did you decide to make this disgusting, horrible movie? Essentially, why did you decide to make this?" And one of the producers was saying that, well, we were hoping that maybe it would become some sort of classic in the genre. And the guy's like, "This isn't going to be a classic. You think this film is going to be a classic movie?" And then he walked out. Well, to that guy, I can safely say, and so can everyone else, that you were dead wrong. Halloween is every bit of a classic horror film as Psycho or Robert Wise's The Haunting or James Whale's Frankenstein. Like, it is, when people think of horror, Halloween is one of the first titles that comes to mind for a lot of people, and for good reason, because it really is a fantastic film. Now, I don't know if I'm going to say anything that hasn't already been said by a bunch of other critics, but I'm going to give it my best shot. Now, Halloween is directed by John Carpenter. It was actually released on October 25th of 1978. It didn't do that well. It was one of those films that was only released in a couple theaters in the Midwest initially, and it was due to word of mouth that the ticket sales for those theaters increased substantially, and then because of that, other theaters started to get the film in stock, and then it started to get a wider release, and then by the end of it, after like a 3-month build-up, the film ended up grossing over $70 million worldwide, which is unbelievably impressive. Now, I don't necessarily think it was over 70, but it was around 70 million. So, $70 million worldwide for 1978 made it the most successful independent film of all time. And if you adjust it to inflation, it is still one of the most successful films in the independent arena. And it just goes to show you the importance and the just the impact of word of mouth, and how you, if you make a good film, doesn't matter who distributes it, as long as it gets to an audience and the audience likes what they see, the film is going to be a hit. 9 times out of 10. Now, there are instances where that isn't the case, sadly, but most of the time that's the case. If it's a film that is well made, it's well put together, there is an audience that's going to find it, and they're going to appreciate it, and they're going to talk to the other people that would appreciate it, and they're going to like it, and then they're going to tell other people that might like it, and then it's going to cause this chain reaction, and it's going to create a demand for the film. And that's what happened with Halloween. And if you think about Halloween, unlike some of these other films in the genre that would come later, that were heavily inspired by its success. In fact, you can argue that Halloween is the king of the modern slasher films. It's where the modern slasher was debuted to the mainstream. Psycho, you could argue, is the first slasher film ever, but Halloween is the one that really started this giant boom of slashers, because after Halloween you had stuff like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and so on and so forth. So this is a film that was a definite watershed moment for the genre. And in the early 80s, it was just slashers, and more slashers. And a big reason why is because this film was so successful. And all of the studios that the major distributors that turned this film down were kicking themselves, and they were all like, well, now we want to get our own Halloween. And that's why you had a whole influx of slasher movies in the early 80s and the late 70s after Halloween came out. And it also led to a lot of studios taking more risks with stuff like Alien. Because, well, this was profitable. Well, maybe we could take a risk like this, this script called Star Beast. And, let's go with that. So, yeah. Now, it's directed by John Carpenter, who before this already showed that he was a capable director with Assault on Precinct 13, but he hadn't really started to do horror yet. So this isn't an instance of a director who was already known for being the horror guy. Like, he hadn't really done that yet. He'd done sci-fi and then little independent cult action thriller. So this was John Carpenter's first foray into the genre that he would become known for. I mean, most people would say that John Carpenter is one of the best directors of the horror genre, and for good reason. And it also helps that he was really passionate about this particular genre. He really loved this. He loved horror ever since he was a kid, so he was really looking forward to lending his own personal hand to horror and to put his own personal touch on it. And when the producers, I believe it was Mustafa, I don't think Mustafa Akkad is the one, but the guy who ran Compass International Pictures, he approached Carpenter if he wanted to do a horror film. And Carpenter was like, yes, absolutely. And he was like, well, we're thinking about doing something with babysitters. Kind of like with a killer and babysitters, because babysitters are popular, and most people know about babysitters, or have babysitters babysit their kids, and so we can have kids in the film, and you can have all these other sort of things, and teenagers. And I think it'd be a great idea. And I remember, I think one of the initial titles was The Babysitter Murders, and then they decided, no, let's try to go with something else. And one of the producers was like, well, what about Halloween? And he looked up the records and checked to see if there was a movie called Halloween, and there wasn't, which shocked him. And what shocked him even more was that there wasn't even a single film that even used Halloween in the title. So it was luck of the draw, basically, that no film had used Halloween before. And that's why Halloween got the title Halloween, because there wasn't really any other movies that had used the title. And then they decided to incorporate Halloween the holiday into the rest of the movie, and the rest is history. They didn't really necessarily know if they were going to have it take place on Halloween or not. So, and a big thanks has to go out to Bob Clark, because Bob Clark, he initially had the idea for a horror film that took place on Halloween. When he was working on what would eventually become Black Christmas, his first thought was to do a film that took place on Halloween, a horror film that took place on All Hallows Eve, and he was going to call it. He was even thinking about calling it Halloween, but he decided against that because he felt that was too cliched of an option. That was the obvious choice, so he went with Christmas instead, and that's honestly the reason why the production was able to use Halloween as the title for Halloween, because Bob Clark decided to not use it. So, a lot of ways, this franchise has Bob Clark to thank for allowing them to even use this iconic title in the first place. Now, the film also features a script by John Carpenter and Deborah Hill. And Deborah Hill also produced the film. She was one of the producers, along with Tommy Lee Wallace, who would go on to direct Halloween 3. Now, Deborah Hill and John Carpenter had already established a previous working relationship because they'd worked together on Assault on Precinct 13, John Carpenter's previous film. So they already knew how to work with each other. In fact, all the crew members, I think, were similar to the same crew members who worked on John's last film. So that really led to a lot of chemistry and enabled this very small crew to put together a very ambitious film in a small amount of time. And it just goes to show you that it's a very valuable thing to have a working relationship with your coworkers and so on and so forth that is already it is already established prior. So then you don't have to worry about chemistry issues, and you also know what your crew is capable of. And John definitely knew what his crew was capable of, and he put them through the ringer. And the result was amazing, and it was well then worth. It was absolutely worth it. It was more than worth it in the end. Now, Deborah Hill is the one that lended her perspective to the dialogue of the girls and so on and so forth, and that was very needed. In fact, I thought that was a really nice touch, and that's another slight, not necessarily slight, but it's another reason why the film works so well is because you have dialogue that feels so authentic. You have these girls who babysit, who are also best friends, and their dialogue is very authentic. It doesn't feel fake. It doesn't sound like it's the ideas of some guy who is just assuming what girls would be talking about. And that happens a lot. And that's another thing about this film that I don't necessarily think is overlooked, but it's something that some people kind of take for granted because they kind of think like, well, oh, it's just dialogue between a bunch of girls. But it just, there's something about it that it just feels so real and authentic. And a big reason why is because Deborah Hill knew what what girls were talking about and what they like to talk about and how they would say it. And John Carpenter wasn't really the guy who knew how to do that type of dialogue. So he said, "All right, Deborah, do your best," and she knocked it out of the park. Now, the film stars a cast and crew of, at the time, a bunch of unknowns. Donald Pleasence was the headliner, and Jamie Lee Curtis would go on to become this big name years later and fairly soon after this movie came out. But before this, she was just known as being a cast member on a TV show called Petticoat Junction. And this was her acting debut on a feature film. So this is her feature film debut, and she was very nervous, and she was actually worried about getting fired after the first day on set. And she definitely has a pedigree because her mother, Janet Leigh, she was in Psycho as well as a bunch of other things. So there is a horror film pedigree as well as a acting pedigree in her family, but she really wasn't that experienced. And initially she wanted to do the role that PJ Souls would get because she really was a bubbly gal. Like, she wasn't this shy, withdrawn, repressed character or in real life. Like, she was outgoing, just full of personality. But that's a big reason why I think John wanted her. Like, initially though, she wasn't the first choice. It was this other actress who turned it down, and then one of the producers mentioned Jamie Lee, and Jamie Lee auditioned, and then she got the role as Laurie Strode, and it is now like one of the most memorable roles of her career. Her performance is fine. It's not like her performance is like the best acting ever. It's really solid for what she is asked to do, and it does not seem like she's just some first time actor trying to figure it out. So she definitely was a star in the making because you could see it in this film. This is a very talented actress who was given a role where she was just meant to be this vulnerable girl who was shy and then has to face her fears and her and also her own inability to be outgoing, which is one of the main themes that John Carpenter was trying to get across, this theme of repression and the repressed. And so on top of Jamie Lee Curtis, you also had PJ Souls, who before this was in films like Carrie, is a similar bad girl character. So she plays Linda, and she just relished this role, and it shows. She's really good at playing these type of characters. Nancy Kyes played Annie Brackett. Now, Nancy at the time was actually, I think she was related to one of the producers at the time. So that's why they ended up getting her for the role. And then you had Charles Cyphers, who played Sheriff Lee Brackett. You had Kyle Richards, who played Lindsay Wallace, one of the girls. I think it was the girl, that little girl that Annie was babysitting. And then you had Brian Andrews, who was playing Tommy Doyle. Now, there are a bunch of other cast members and so on and so forth, but really, the main ones are those. You also had Nick Castle, who was really passionate about making films and wanted to make his own movies and was friends with John Carpenter. And so we asked him if he could hang out on the set, and he was like, yeah, but here's something to do. How about you play Michael Myers? Would you put on this jumpsuit and this mask? And so for most of the shots where you see Michael Myers walking around and things like that, that's all Nick Castle. And what's kind of funny is Nick Castle asked John Carpenter, he's like, what's my character's motivation? And John Carpenter was like, walk straight, get out of the car, walk. Like, he's like, don't act, walk. Which is why the character works as well as it does, because he's not thinking about how I should act. It's not really acting. It's just doing. And but he does admit that Nick did add his own things, his own personal approach to the character, though, because the fact that Nick, he was actually ballet, he was into ballet, so he was really in tune with his movements. So he wanted Michael Myers to have this unnatural sort of movement, this robotic sort of movement, and Nick nailed that. He absolutely killed it in that aspect, and one of the most iconic scenes in the film for me, and it's a film that has tons of iconic scenes, is the one after he kills Bob, who's played by John Michael Graham. So he kills Bob, and then he does this head tilt thing. He just looks at him with this, like he's curious, like he's looking at, like John Carpenter said, a butterfly collection, and it's just a really memorable scene because it just shows you like there's something unearthly about this Michael Myers. And Tony Moran played the Michael Myers character who was unmasked because the producers were thinking we need someone who's like angelic looking or something, and they felt that Nick Castle really didn't have the right look that they were looking for. I think they should have just had Nick Castle be the one that's Michael Myers under the mask as well, instead of Tony Moran. And Will Sandon, he played Michael Myers age 6. But it's actually PJ Souls who's the one in the point of view shot at the beginning of the film who's grabbing the knife and walking up the stairs and stabbing the sister. So, yeah, really solid cast. And Donald Pleasence is, I mean, everyone does their jobs really well. Donald Pleasence, of course, is the one that, if you ask me, is the real standout. He doesn't have that many lines or that many scenes, but he aces all of them so well that he just leaves an immense impact. And just so many of his scenes are just so great. The Devil's Eyes speech, which was actually inspired by John Carpenter's real life experiences. He went to a psych ward when he was a kid. He wasn't a kid; he was a teenager. So it was in high school, and I think maybe it was college, but it was definitely a school and a class of some kind. And he went with his classmates to a psych ward, to a mental institution, and checked out all the different patients there. And he had an unforgettable experience with a 13-year-old patient who had this really eerie stare, and it really scared him, and it really stuck with him, and it shook him. And so he incorporated his own experience with that into that line of dialogue, and that just adds a whole other element to this film, because John Carpenter took from his own personal experiences and added that to the script, which is just puts it on a whole different level. And Donald Pleasence was not the first choice. Donald Pleasence was a last-minute replacement. Last minute decision, last minute guy who the producers thought, well, wouldn't this be nice? Because John Carpenter's first two choices all turned him down. His first choice was Peter Cushing, but he had just come off of Star Wars, and his agent buffed off John Carpenter and said, your movie's too cheap. My client will never appear in a movie that cheap. Then he asked Christopher Lee, and Christopher Lee turned it down. And what's kind of interesting about that is that years later, John would meet up with Christopher, and Christopher would tell him that turning down that role was one of the biggest mistakes of his career. And it was one of the producers who was like, well, what about Donald Pleasence? He's got this presence to him. He can play these crazy guy roles, but he also just said there's something about him that's just so compelling and interesting. And they went for Donald Pleasence, and surprisingly, he agreed to do it. So they took out an extra $20,000, tacked it on to the $300,000 budget, and gave the $20,000 to Donald Pleasence to shoot for 2 weeks. And the only reason why he signed up to do the film is because his daughter was in a rock band, and she had seen Assault on Precinct 13, and she liked the music. So she's like, yeah, I really like John Carpenter, I like his music. And so Donald Pleasence was like, all right, I'll work with John Carpenter. So, so in a way, you kind of got to thank Donald Pleasence's daughter for Donald Pleasence's just spectacular, just phenomenal performance as Dr. Loomis, which what would ultimately go on to be the role that he would be known for to this day. So, but yeah, he was only there for a week, but he's very professional about it and was a total pro. And he ultimately did start to really get into the role and really had fun on the sets. And despite the really intense subject matter, this is a really fun set. John Carpenter and Deborah Hill and Jamie Lee Curtis and all the other gals, they all really got along really well. And you can definitely tell that, because you can feel the passion emanating off the screen when you watch this movie. It was a passion project for everyone involved. They all worked their butts off equally. Even the actors were helping with the crew and helping move things around and so on and so forth. There wasn't anybody who was resting on their laurels. Everybody was giving their utmost effort to the film, and it shows. It shows in every shot in this movie. This is a very ambitious project, and it shows you that even if you have a low budget, you can still shoot for the stars, and you can still do some really just jaw-dropping, spectacular things. Thanks to the invention of the Steadicam, John Carpenter was able to get one and use that for multiple sequences in the film. For the POV shots of young Michael Myers in the beginning of the movie, which are just... The opening of this film is one of the best openings in cinematic history, if you ask me. It is such a well-edited and shot opening. It is ambitious as hell. It's risky, but it works. And it adds so much more to this movie. It makes the film feel like it's bigger than its budget. It makes it look and feel like it's a $20 million movie, or even a $10 million, like not necessarily $20 million, because that's a lot in '78, but a $5 million film instead of a $320,000 movie, which is what this movie. It only cost $320,000. And so you had this really ambitious Steadicam shots, which Dean Cundey just performed with excellent accuracy and efficiency. And then you just had these other sort of, trying to figure out what the locations are. And John Carpenter's like, well, what about my hometown of Hollywood, California? There's this area that I think would work really well. And even though there's little palm trees that you can see, it still does evoke this feeling of mid-America, Illinois. And they cut corners. They worked around things. They were creative. Something that a lot of filmmakers today aren't. Sadly, because they have all this money in the world to work with, unless they're working on independent films. But these big budget filmmakers, they don't really have to be that creative. They can be like, well, we'll do this in post. Oh, we'll just do this CGI. Oh, well, we'll do this behind a green screen. And oh, we'll not do that, but we'll do this instead because it's easier. And with films like Halloween, you got to think on your feet. You got to be really creative and think outside the box. And John Carpenter and company did that and then some. And that's why the film. That's not the only reason why the film is so iconic and such a great movie, but that's a big part of it, because they thought of ways to make this budget just not only last, but look great and look amazing. Now, Dean Cundey, yeah, his cinematography is, this is a guy who would go on to do countless films for John Carpenter and countless films for other studios. He'd become one of the most highly sought after cinematographers in Hollywood. And you could see every reason why. Because this is a guy who isn't just like a competent cinematographer. He was an auteur, and he was a one-of-a-kind talent when it comes to being behind the camera right here in 1978. From the beginning of his career, he was already a one-of-a-kind, unique talent. And you can definitely see that in every shot that he shot for this film. It's just, Dean Cundey, I can't sing his praises enough. And I definitely can't sing the praises enough of John Carpenter with his direction and also with his collaboration and cooperation with Dean. They also had really great chemistry, and they seemed to be on the same wavelength. And speaking of John Carpenter, the score for Halloween is, in my opinion, a prime example of the importance of a score for a film. Halloween would not be as suspenseful or thrilling or chilling as it is without John Carpenter's score. John showed the film without a score to investors at 20th Century Fox. They weren't impressed. And when you watch some footage without the score, the sequences aren't that eerie. They're not that bone-curdling. The sequences aren't as suspenseful or as tense. But when you add that score, it just ratchets things to a whole other notch. The suspense gets turned up way past 11. I've seen this film countless times, and there are so many scenes in this movie, especially near the climax, where my teeth are grinding. I'm holding my hands to my face. I'm feeling the effects of the mastery, the masterful masterwork of Halloween, and the suspense, the Hitchcockian suspense. And it's nail biting because not only because of how it's shot, which is a big part of it. The way that the film has all these different shots with Michael Myers in the peripheral is just, it almost leaves me speechless because it's done so seamlessly and it's so effective. And for me personally, that always gets me. No matter what the movie is, It Follows, Halloween, so on and so forth. Shots in the peripheral vision where there's someone behind the main character. They can't see them, but you could see them. And it just adds so much suspense to any film, because it's like he's right there, and then you know what's going to happen, but it's the anticipation that is what builds the suspense. It's not exactly what's going to happen. It's the anticipation of when something is going to happen that makes it suspenseful. And John knew that. He even said that in an interview. He's like, it's the anticipation that gets you. And John also had an undeniable style and flair to his direction too. And even in the death scenes, this isn't really gory. There's barely any blood. Annie's death is is almost giallo. It's almost like something you would see from Dario Argento, with its lighting and with this how surreal it is, with the girl in the front of the seat of the front seat of the car. Michael Myers shows up and strangles her, and you see her breath on the window. And you have Bob, who you have Michael Myers kills him, stabs him, and then looks at him like he's a butterfly in a butterfly collection. And then you have, just a simple act of aggression when Michael Myers strangles PJ Souls' character Linda. But he's also wearing a sheet with Bob's glasses, which makes it even more creepy. And you're also wonder, like, why did he do that? What was going on in his head? Why did he guess he decided maybe that's how he's gonna trick his victim into thinking that it's the guy he just killed? Either way, it's a nice touch. And then, yeah, I mean, it's not really high body count. There's not really tons of blood and gore. It's more about the mood and the atmosphere and this just eeriness. This really overwhelming sense of dread that permeates throughout the film as soon as Michael Myers escapes from the institution. I mean, even from the beginning of the movie, it's just this really you just feel this evil surround you. And definitely in the end of the movie with the montage with just Michael Myers' heavy breathing in the background, which is really fucking creepy. Like, one of the creepiest things in the film to me is the ending, where it's just these random shots of where he might have been or where he is, and it was like, oh man. And like John Carpenter said himself, he said something that was definitely pretty creepy. He said that, oh, that's because he's everywhere. The shape is everywhere now. He might be in the house next door. He might be in your house. He might be in my house. So, yeah. But it's just, this is a film where I could just go on for hours about how great it is. Easily. The editing by Tommy Wallace and Charles Bornstein, excellent. This is a film that's paced perfectly. There's not a dull moment, if you ask me. It's 91 minutes. It goes by at a lightning fast pace, even though it takes a little bit to get going. But once it starts to get going, it does not stop. It's just a breakneck series of chills and thrills. And the climax is easily one of the most powerful and intense climaxes I've seen in any horror film. And it's just a tour de force. I mean, as it builds and builds and builds, and Michael Myers is like right there in the closet with Laurie, and it's this close encounter, and it's terrifying. And I also love the fact that Michael Myers was seemingly always around in the film. Almost from the beginning, you had him as a kid, and then when he escaped, he was driving around Haddonfield. He was near the main characters. He was appearing behind their backs without them knowing. And then as the film gets further into its story and goes further in terms of the running time, that's when like things get even more intense, because he's getting closer and closer and closer until that moment where he's attacking Laurie in the closet. And a big part of that is editing. I mean, the opening sequence is a series of edits, because the film that they were using to shoot with the Steadicam, it could only shoot one reel at a time. So they would do this one long tracking shot, and then they run out of film. So then they have to do another tracking shot, and then run out of film again, and then do another one, and then run out of film then. And so they had to think of something like, what are we gonna do? Because we keep running out of film. So I think it might have been Dean Cundy or it was John who was like, well, let's edit these together. And I think it might have been the editor. So it might have been Tommy Wallace, who was an editor as well as a producer. And he was the guy who found the mask. Now, That's definitely something I have to mention when it comes to Halloween. The mask. I mean, it's, you know, it's one of those things where if Michael Myers wore anything else, would he really be a horror icon? I doubt it. Now, it was between two choices. Tommy Lee Wallace, he went to a store and there was a clown mask and a William Shatner mask. William Shatner Star Trek mask. And they decided, no, they're not going to go with a clown mask because what they were looking for was something that was featureless. Because John Carpenter had written that, and he had wrote that in the script, that Michael Myers is featureless. He wore this mask that had no features because he was inspired by this foreign film, which had this lady who her face got burned, and she wore this mask that had no features on it. All you could see was her eyes. And so he wisely decided to incorporate that into Michael Myers. And so they went with the William Shatner mask, and Tommy Lee Wallace, he got creative and he tore the eye holes open a bit wider and cut off the sideburns and spray painted it white. And from the very moment that the mask was first debuted to the crew, like they already knew that this was something else. Like this was gonna work. And it was unlike anything they'd ever seen, and it sent chills down their spine. And yeah, who would have thought that William Shatner would be the face of fear for many years to come? John Carpenter, though, he tends to like not necessarily give William Shatner credit because he's like, that mask looked nothing like William Shatner. And if you look at it, it kind of doesn't. It kind of doesn't look like William Shatner. But the William Shatner it kind of does look like is William Shatner from The Devil's Reign. If you've ever seen that movie, like he's got no eyes in that, and I think William Shatner is in that. I could be wrong. I know John Travolta is in that, and Ernest Borgnine, but I don't think William Shatner is in that. No, yeah, he is. He is in it. And there's this particular shot in the film where William Shatner, well, there's one with John Travolta. John Travolta has no eyes. And there's a scene where William Shatner doesn't have any eyes either. But the one with John Travolta with no eyes looks a lot like Michael Myers. And Michael Myers, the name itself, is also a homage, a way for John Carpenter to thank a real life person named Michael Myers, who was one of the UK distributor, one of the guys who helped distribute the Assault on Precinct 13 in the UK. So that was his way of thanking Michael Myers. He's like, hey, thank you, Michael Myers. I'm going to make you this psychopathic murderer. And yeah, I'm going to make you a horror icon. But anyway, yeah, so definitely want to talk about the mask because when people think about Halloween, they definitely think of the mask. The advertising, even though there wasn't that much in terms of a budget, they had like one theatrical trailer, maybe a couple of TV spots and radio spots. The poster is just, it is amazing. It is such a terrific poster. It really is. It's like it's so iconic with the pumpkin, the jack-o'-lantern with the knife. So that's another thing that really helped sell the film to audiences because they're like, wow, that's such a cool poster. I want to see that movie. And yeah, the film was an enormous hit. Inspired numerous sequels and reboots and so on and so forth. And you could argue that things didn't get better after this, or things never got quite to the same heights with this franchise as there was with the first film. Well, and you can argue that there are other films in the franchise that were close. But there's just something about the first that is just so inviting. You know, it's such an inviting a thing, and it's such a And iconic is definitely the best way to put it. Such an iconic film in so many ways. Now, I don't know what else to say about the film except if I were to rate it out of 5 stars, I'm giving it 5 out of 5. Why would I give anything else than that? I mean, you got likable characters, you got fantastic, just absolutely stunning direction by John Carpenter, great cinematography, all of the technical elements are terrific. Aesthetics are are definitely the opposite of atrocious. I mean, there are a couple moments though that kind of made me like, why is there a jack-o'-lantern in the bedroom? Like, why is there a lit jack-o'-lantern in there? Who keeps a lit jack-o'-lantern on their bedside table? But that was just for aesthetics, and I mean the film's not really trying to be realistic, so it wasn't that big of a deal. And then those multiple times when Laurie kept dropping the knife. Like, this is one thing I definitely had to mention. It doesn't hurt my enjoyment of the film that much at all. It doesn't really hurt my rating of the film that at all either. It's just something I noticed. Like, she just keeps dropping the knife constantly. Like, she has the knife. She could stab him, and she doesn't do it. So, but other than those two things, and maybe some of the line delivery by the actress who plays Annie, Nancy Kyes, is a little bit iffy, especially at the start. But she evens out as the film goes on, so it's not really like it's a bad performance. But other than that, I can't think of anything I find personally wrong with the movie. I mean, the movie even featured "Don't Fear the Reaper" by Blue Oyster Cult in the soundtrack, which is an inspired choice because it's a nice lead-in to what would happen soon afterwards, where the Reaper would be coming in the form of Michael Myers to Haddonfield. Now, I don't know what else to say about the film itself, but when it comes to this Blu-ray, got some pretty this has two discs. So it has the disc 1 has the 35th anniversary edition, and disc 2 is the 2007 release. Now the 35th anniversary edition has the best print of the film because it's supervised by Dean Cundy, so it looks the way that the film is supposed to look like. The 2007 print is brighter and doesn't look as... I definitely don't think it looks as good as the 35th anniversary print, because that's closer to what the film was intended to be seen as in the theater. The 2007 one is definitely altered in numerous ways. Now, the first disc includes a commentary track with John Carpenter, Jamie Lee Curtis, as well as a new commentary track with Dean Cundy, Tommy Lee Wallace, and Nick Castle. And I gotta be honest, I'm not really a commentary guy, so I can't give you my thoughts on those because I don't really listen to them. The Night She Came Home featurette, it's okay. I thought it was a bit dull. It's 59 minutes, and it's fun to see Jamie Lee Curtis be fairly appreciative, not fairly, I mean be very appreciative about Halloween and show a lot of her personality. But it came across as just an extended vlog. That's all it really was. It was just a vlog. And there were some interesting fun things, but overall I would have preferred to have seen biographies, Halloween, the Inside Story included on here instead. On Location, 25 years later featurette. I think it's from back in the day. Shows like some of the locations from the film. It's okay. TV version footage, which John Carpenter admitted he whored out for. Add some backstory, character development, extra character developments. Definitely add some more to the events before Michael Myers would escape, but a lot of it's not really necessary. But the stuff with Loomis in the TV version, I actually think that's quite good, and I actually would not mind having that in the film. It adds some nice context to the events that would eventually transpire. Theatrical trailer, TV, radio spots. You would think that this film would have like some 2-hour long documentary about it, but no, it doesn't. Disc 2 has an audio commentary with John Carpenter, Jamie Lee Curtis, and Deborah Hill. I think it's from an older DVD. And then you have the featurette Halloween, a cut above the rest, which is a 87-minute long documentary. I believe it aired on Fox, because it definitely aired around the time of H2O, because there's Jamie Lee Curtis with her H2O haircut, and they're promoting H2O at the end, and it's a solid documentary, some nice interviews. A lot of the information I told you in this video I got from that documentary. But I definitely have to say about the documentary that it's definitely one of those like really dated late 90s documentaries with the quick cuts and the flashes, and it's a bit obnoxious at times, but it's a solid documentary. I would probably say the biography inside story is a little bit better because it's a little bit more polished, but that also covers a lot of the same information. So it's one of those things that it's nice that you at least have one of the two. And Shout Factory, Scream Factory didn't have to include both, but they did, which was a nice choice, because if you didn't have the second disc that had the cut above the rest documentary, it's a pretty bare bones and disappointing. Because the Night She Came Home featurette, it's it's fun to watch maybe once, but that's it. It's not really, as for me personally, I'm more interested about the making of the movie, not about some convention years later where Jamie Lee Curtis is returning and talking to fans and so on and so forth. It's fun to see that side of Jamie Lee, but that's not what I'm interested in. But overall, though, it's the print is much improved on the 35th anniversary edition, and it's I mean it is a little disappointing when you think about this is Halloween. This is one of the most iconic horror films of all time. I think we could have a little bit more in-depth features that aren't like old. Like, I mean, from 1998 in terms of like the longest documentary, or one that's like 59 minutes that isn't really necessarily about the making of the movie. But anyway, yeah, I've talked your ear off enough. I didn't intend for this to be that long, but you know what? Fuck it. This is the film that there's so much to say about it, and is such a, I keep saying amazing and marvelous and fantastic and spectacular and stupendous, and it is every single one of those things. And it makes sense that this review is every bit as gigantic and as immense as the film itself. So anyway, thank you for watching, and as always, I will see you later. See ya.